our traditional post-pandemic greeting, but hello from New York City. We at the Soufan Center are really delighted to host this webinar in partnership with the Airey Neave Trust and with our co-sponsors, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Finland, and in partnership with the OCT. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Noreen Chowdhury Fink. I'm the Executive Director of the Soufan Center. We're an independent nonprofit center offering research, analysis, and strategic dialogue on global security challenges and foreign policy issues. It's really great to see so many familiar faces and hopefully meet many new ones along the way as we get through our discussion today. Our team at the Soufan Center has been analyzing the transnational violent far-right and white supremacy extremist threat since 2019, in addition to our consistent research on Salafi and jihadist groups. We hope this discussion today on violent far-right groups, white supremacists, and terrorism offers diplomats, experts, and practitioners some pertinent analysis on the threat of violent far-right extremism. Today's discussion will consider in particular the international dimensions of violent far-right extremist groups, including racially and ethnically motivated groups and white supremacists. And we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned and experiences in dealing with these threats from a state, practitioner, or academic perspective. I should add that this is part of an ongoing project we are conducting in partnership with the Airey Neave Trust, and we hope to have a report out this summer which will look at the evolution of the violent far-right threat, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. So this is part of our project, and we look forward to your insights and your perspectives, which will also inform our analysis. Before we get started, a few housekeeping. We can't get through meetings these days without them. So I just wanted to flag for many of you that this event is being live streamed and recorded, and so it will be available publicly online afterwards. I'd also like to thank those of you who submitted questions ahead of the event, and we'll do our best to incorporate these as we go through the moderated interactive session. Before we begin the panel discussion, we are honored to be joined by our co-hosts and partners in this event, and I'd like to offer them the floor for some opening remarks. First, on behalf of the United States, we have Irfan Saeed, who is Acting Deputy Coordinator for Prevention and Detention in the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism. Following that, we will have, on behalf of the United Kingdom, Kingsley Green, Head of the Counterterrorism and Extremism Network Europe. And then on behalf of OCT, we will have remarks by Mr. Rafi Gregorian, who is Director and Deputy to the Undersecretary General for Counterterrorism at the United Nations. But now I offer the floor to Irfan Saeed. Irfan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will not start with can you hear me and can you see me? I think I can be heard and be seen. So thank you everyone. Good afternoon. It is absolutely great to see everyone virtually, but I think we all can agree that we look forward to a time in the not too distant future when we can all be in the same room together, sharing not only these important discussions, but handshakes and coffees and desserts and the whole good thing. So again, greatly appreciated. And let me start with some thank yous to Noreen and the Soufan Center in particular. Thank you, not only for everything you've been doing in all of the research, but keeping, I think, the global focus on this particular issue. I remember a few years ago, I believe Soufan Center was the first one to have this discussion on the margins of UNGA, and you've kept a steady drumbeat throughout the pandemic, which was not easy to do, and you were the first ones to go virtual. So again, great kudos to you and the team for everything you're doing to counter REMV. Let me also thank the Airey Neave Trust. Let me thank the United Kingdom. Kingsley, always great to partner with you. And it's great that we're all able to work together to sponsor this event and I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak today about violent white supremacy, a subset of what the United States refers to as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV. Of course, we should also thank the UN Office of Counterterrorism for convening us over the last 2 weeks on these important and timely discussions. A big thank you to the great panelists you will hear from today. Paivi, Laila, Robert, and Colin are amazing at what they do. And I know I'm looking forward to hearing from them shortly. And of course, finally, a big thank you to Amanda and the whole tech team. Without them, we'd all be staring at blank screens saying, can you hear me? Can you see me? So thank you so much to them. So let me just provide some very quick remarks from the United States perspective, because I think it's no secret that over the last few years, we have witnessed an escalation of violence perpetrated by REMV actors. Here at home, REMV actors have drawn upon their hateful ideology to carry out horrific attacks in places like Poway and El Paso, just to name a few. And I know we have a long list of those cities around the world that have suffered horrific attacks at the hands of REMV actors. And of course, the events here at the United States Capitol on January 6th have shown us what can happen when you have this perfect storm of violent white supremacist ideology, misinformation and disinformation that goes unchecked, a global pandemic, xenophobia, and violent extremism. So let me talk a little bit about the threat picture. We know REMV threats are often transnational, with groups and individuals radicalizing to violence, recruiting and sharing tactical training across borders, both online and in person. REMV actors often communicate through online platforms, smaller websites with targeted audiences, and end-to-end encrypted chat applications, often using coded language and symbols. They use these platforms to propagate misinformation and disinformation, and again, share those tactics on how to establish and run training centers and facilities, procure fraudulent travel documents, and clandestinely move people and material. Part of this transnational component includes violent white supremacists traveling overseas to train and fight with like-minded individuals. US-based REMV actors have been known to communicate with and travel abroad to engage in person with foreign REMV actors, primarily in places like Europe, but also in countries such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. We have encouraged foreign partner governments, including Interpol, to include REMV actors as appropriate on their national watch lists and international law enforcement platforms. In addition to their value for border security and law enforcement purposes, these watch lists can also be used for vetting and screening those working in positions of public trust, whether in military, law enforcement, or critical infrastructure. And we encourage our international partners, including all of our fellow UN member states, to take quick, efficient, and appropriate law enforcement action against REMV perpetrators of violent crimes, and to increase law enforcement solutions and engage in surveillance and intelligence to counter REMV while respecting, of course, human rights. Here at the State Department, we are leveraging the full range of diplomatic tools at our disposal to counter this threat. We have sent individuals formerly associated with REMV groups on overseas speaker programs to help counter false REMV narratives and expose REMV tactics based on their own experiences. We've also connected cities around the world through two-way exchange programs focused on countering REMV. Last October, we launched an initiative in partnership with the United Kingdom at the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law, or the IIJ, to share best practices with criminal justice practitioners on how to effectively address REMV. The Strong Cities Network, which now includes over 150 members globally, serves as an important resource for local policymakers and practitioners to push back against REMV influences in their communities. But we must also take a look at how REMV actors connect and share information, especially how they leverage the internet. And to prevent REMV actors from exploiting online platforms for terrorist purposes, we are building on our long-standing counterterrorism related outreach to technology companies to voluntarily share information on REMV trends and tactics. We encourage companies to voluntarily enhance and enforce their terms of service to ensure their platforms are not being misused to host REMV-related content, including coded language and symbols, while of course respecting the freedom of expression. So I want to round this conversation out with a response. What is the United States government doing? And it goes without saying that the countering REMV, including violent white supremacy, within and beyond the United States borders is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration. And through that, the Department of State is working with our interagency colleagues to develop a series of measures to help us meet and counter this threat. On his first full day in office, President Biden directed his national security team to lead a 100-day comprehensive review of US government efforts to address domestic terrorism. And I'm happy to report just 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration released the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism to address this challenge to America's national security and improve our federal government response. Let me just highlight the 4 pillars of that strategy. Number 1, it's understanding and sharing domestic terrorism-related information, which is improving our information sharing across our federal law enforcement partners, but also for the Department of State to assess whether we can further designate as foreign terrorist organizations or specially designated global terrorists under our relevant statutory authority. Number 2, preventing domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization to violence, again, leveraging our very traditional CVE and PVE programs that we've had over a decade, if not longer, of developing. And that includes the United States recently joining the Christchurch Call to Action to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, which is an international partnership between governments and tech companies that works to develop new multilateral solutions to eliminate terrorist content online, while again, safeguarding the freedom of online expression. Number 3, disrupting and deterring domestic terrorism activity. And number 4, confronting the long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. So in conclusion, I know that the road ahead is long. We're at the nascent stages of this fight, but the good news is that we've got a long history of trying to deal with very similar problems of recruitment, radicalization, mobilization, and inspiration to violence. And we can use our ideologically blind tools in our toolkit to counter this threat. Thank you again for the opportunity to say a few words. I look forward to a very interesting discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Irfan, and thank you for your continued support from that very first presentation that we did in 2019 on white supremacy extremism, and we've really appreciated the State Department's support for our work throughout, and thank you for being here. So really wonderful to have you with us. And I now turn to Kingsley Green. It's been wonderful working with the UK. We're really pleased to have you here and look forward to hearing some of your thoughts today as well. So Kingsley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Noreen. Thank you, Irfan. It's great to see you too, and it's always great to go after you because I can start to put lines through what I'm going to say because a lot of it mirrors our analysis and understanding. I'd like to echo Irfan's thanks to the Soufan Center, to the Airey Neave Trust, colleagues from the US and UN OCT who are joining us for this event today, and of course our esteemed panelists. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. From a UK perspective, while the overriding threat, as we see it, remains from Islamist terrorist groups, over the past 2 decades, the scale of the extreme right-wing threat has steadily increased. Since 2017, when Darren Osborne attacked worshippers outside Finsbury Park Mosque, nearly a third of the disrupted terrorist plots in the UK have been inspired by extreme right-wing ideologies. And just in the last year, during 2020, there were about 185 CT-related arrests in the UK, and almost a quarter related to extreme right-wing terrorism. In the UK, extreme right-wing terrorism is an umbrella term that encompasses terrorism motivated by subsets of ideologies. Irfan's already mentioned them, namely white nationalist, cultural nationalist, and of relevance for the discussion today, white supremacist. I know that our partners use different terminology, like REMVE, and others. But from my perspective, though some of our terminology might be different, I don't think this is a barrier to collaboration. Indeed, the transnational nature of the threat means it is important that the international community, both governments and non-government organizations, work together to combat it. That's why events like this are so important, where we can discuss our respective approaches, mutual challenges, and best practice. As I said, this threat is a transnational one. These groups and individuals have demonstrated their ability to manipulate online platforms, provide space for individuals to self-radicalize, and converse with like-minded individuals domestically and across boundaries. We see community building, networking, information sharing, the distribution of manifestos, and tragically, the live streaming of attacks. The fact is, the feature and design of certain platforms and applications provide the perfect space for extreme right-wing terrorism to thrive. The other thing we've seen is internationally the narratives and ideologies that radicalize vulnerable people to the point of violence are becoming increasingly complex. Alongside more established extreme right-wing ideologies, we see relatively well-established conspiracy theories, for example, anti-Semitic ones, alongside newer emerging ones, such as concern about 5G or narratives associated with the COVID pandemic. So far in the UK, we have not seen conspiracy theories and misinformation feature prominently in the terrorist threat picture. But given what we have seen internationally, it's an area of concern, and consequently, I'm looking forward to the discussion today. In terms of our response from a UK perspective, the UK's contest strategy is designed to be threat agnostic, and we've got a range of flexible tools that enable us to combat all threats. We keep the effectiveness of our response under review and adapt as necessary. And I'm just going to give 3 examples where we see these threat agnostic tools being effective against the extreme right-wing terrorism threat. I'm going to touch on prescription, work in the online space, and prevention. The UK considers prescription an effective tool for disrupting extreme right-wing terrorist groups. And you will have seen we've prescribed 3 such groups. Prescription sends a strong message that these groups are not tolerated in the UK, deters them from operating there. I would say here, but I'm actually in Belgium now, so you'll see what I mean. And importantly, it supports other disruptive activities. In the online space, we're deploying the very best of HMG's approach to preventing terrorist use of the internet. We're leveraging our existing relationships with tech companies and our international partners to develop more effective approaches to tackling extreme right-wing terrorism. From a UK perspective, we've seen a marked increase in extreme right-wing related referrals to our counterterrorism internet referral unit, and a corresponding increase in the removal of such content by online platforms. But we think there's more that we can do in this area. We've also published our online safety bill, a truly world-leading and much-needed law which will strengthen our approach to tackling terrorist content online. Finally, prevention, which remains the cornerstone of our domestic approach. The UK's Prevent programme seeks to tackle the causes of radicalisation and respond to the ideological challenge of terrorism in all its forms, including extreme right-wing terrorism. A key part of that is our Channel programme, which is all about safeguarding individuals who are considered vulnerable to radicalisation by these narratives. And finally, and it's what I started with, I'd like to touch on international collaboration, which has always been an integral part of our contest strategy. Like other forms of terrorism, the international nature of the extreme right-wing terrorism threat means we need to work with international partners, both inside and outside of government, to tackle it. I'm just going to thank again Noreen, the Soufan Center, the Airey Neave Trust, everyone who's taken the time to join this discussion, and the expert panelists who we'll hear from shortly. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Kingsley, thanks so much for sharing that overview on how you see the threat and its evolution in the UK, and also for highlighting some of those concrete measures taken. I think it's been really helpful to hear from both you and Irfan the kind of state-centric measures that have been taken in a relatively short amount of time to make sure that the CT response remains responsive, to this evolving threat. So thank you for that. I will now turn over the screen. Since I don't have a floor to turn over, I'll turn over the screen for remarks by Mr. Rafi Gregorian from the UN Office of Counterterrorism.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me first thank the Soufan Center and the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States for organizing this side event on white supremacy, conspiracy theorists, and violent extremism. As we've heard throughout this second Counterterrorism Week, the terrorist threat from neo-Nazi and other ethnically or racially motivated movements is on the rise. It has become the #1 national security threat for many countries in Europe, North America, and Oceania, and evidence of its transnational dimensions is increasing. The Secretary General had alerted member states to this threat in April 2018, and again in February 2020, just before the onset of COVID-19 crisis, which has only magnified the phenomenon further. And in February this year, the Secretary General called for global coordinated action to tackle it. Among UN partners, we have held several rounds of discussions on this topic, including in the Secretary General's high-level action group on preventing violent extremism. The aim has been to improve our own understanding of the phenomenon, the legal, human rights, and gender aspects, and the need to encourage member states to follow a principled, consistent, and multidimensional response. As food for thought for today, I would like to highlight 3 challenges in moving forward. First, terminology. We all know what we are talking about when discussing these groups, but how to refer to them has been very contentious, owing to different legal, political, and cultural realities and sensitivities. This makes the recent consensus review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy all the more practically important, since it now provides a reference point. The General Assembly called on member states to take appropriate measures to address the new and emerging threats posed by the rise in terrorist attacks on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, including through investigation, information exchange, and cooperation. Second, legal clarity and consistency. It is incumbent on each member state to define terrorism and acts of terrorism in line with international law, including human rights, and not to conflate terrorism, violent extremism, hate crimes, and hate speech, which could result in an overextensive application of the counterterrorism framework. At the same time, each state must also apply its national definitions consistently in similar situations, irrespective of the background and perceived motivations of the individuals involved, lest it create impressions of double standards. Still, the lack of international definition and designations of specific groups will continue to make the removal of online content related to this form of terrorism difficult across jurisdictions. And third, dedicated focus and tailored approach. Although we have an extensive CT-PCVE toolbox to draw from, experience has also taught us that effectiveness lies in cooperation and tailored implementation. For this, we need to develop a better common understanding of the phenomenon, which is decentralized and ideologically fragmented, yet also networked and mutually reinforcing. And events such as today's are key to bringing about convergence, collaboration, and joint action. This is especially important to being able to uncover and address transnational dimensions. Dear colleagues, the General Assembly has mandated the Secretary General to produce a report before September next year in consultation with member states on the motivations, objectives, organization, and the threat posed by such groups, and effective counter-narratives, capacities, and strategies in this regard. This will be another important step forward. To conclude, I want to highlight UNOCT's global program on PCVE as a good example of how UN entities are already leveraging their existing work to address this threat. For example, the program has provided training for journalists and social media activists in South Asia on how to detect misinformation. It has also supported young leaders to design their own policy solutions against the rise of white supremacist narratives in schools in Sweden and Australia. And we now seek to spearhead research and collaboration on countering the use of online gaming platforms by neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and other violent groups. More can be done. More should be done, and we look forward to working with interested member states, partners, and donors to tackle the threat posed by those adhering to violence to achieve their hateful aims. I look forward to the outcome of today's discussion and to our continued cooperation. Thank you.
With many thanks to our co-hosts for those opening remarks, I'd now like to introduce our fantastic group of panelists here today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Päivi Karamo, who currently serves as the Ambassador for Counterterrorism Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland. She has previously served as Ambassador of Finland to Turkey, and before that, as Permanent Representative of Finland to Geneva, in terms of the UN, the WTO, and other international organizations. She has also worked as the Secretary General of the Office of the President of the Republic of Finland and the Chief of the Presidential Cabinet as the Diplomatic Advisor of the President of the Republic of Finland and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in many different positions. Next, we have with us Leila Bukhari, who has previously served as State Secretary and Deputy Minister with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as State Secretary at the Office of the Norwegian Prime Minister. Lila is a Kistefos Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and she has also previously worked as a researcher on security policy, counterterrorism, and religious and political extremism at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, and King's College London, among other institutions. Third, and I'm not at all developing an inferiority complex with this list before me. Third, we have Robert Orell, who is a member of the steering committee of the European Commission's Radicalization Awareness Network and co-leader of the Rehabilitation Working Group. Previously, Robert has served as director of Exit Sweden for 10 years. Robert has over 2 decades of experience in disengagement from political extremism and criminal gangs, and his recent work focuses on organizing exit programs, advising on policy guidelines and recommendations, and understanding radicalization in online gaming communities. And last but not least, we have Colin Clark, who is a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center and also a director of policy and research at the Soufan Group. His research focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security, and geopolitics. Colin was previously a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and a senior political scientist at the Rand Corporation, where he spent a decade researching terrorism, insurgency, and criminal networks. I think I got all of that right, and I'm tremendously pleased to be here with all these fantastic panelists. I'd like to hand the floor to Päivi, then Leila, then Robert, and lastly to Colin for their remarks. Päivi, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Madam Moderator, thank you very much, Noreen, for giving me the floor. And first, like the other speakers, I would like to thank the Soufan Center and the Airey Neave Trust for organizing this side event in the context of the UN High-Level Counterterrorism Conference. Finland is very pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of this very timely event, and I'm very happy to participate in the panel with such esteemed co-panelists and speakers and present some remarks as a representative of my country. Finland condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, regardless of the underlying ideology or religious orientation, which I wish to stress as a general remark at the outset. Finland also underlines the importance of effective multilateral cooperation in countering violent extremism and terrorism. We subscribe to the UN and EU position that any measures to counter terrorism, whether international or national, must be fully compatible with the rule of law and with the obligations under international law, including the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. The UN General Assembly either already reaffirmed or is about to reaffirm this approach today by adopting the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review Resolution. In our national and international efforts, we must address all forms of violent extremism. For us, this includes politically motivated violent extremism and terrorism, including the threat posed by violent far right and far left. Therefore, we very much regret that this phenomenon was not explicitly included in the above-mentioned GCTS review resolution. By leaving this out, we kind of fail to acknowledge some of the most significant emerging threats in many countries. We are pleased, however, that the reference to the Christchurch Call Initiative is included in the CA resolution. Violent extremism is an evolving phenomenon, and the extremist landscape has become more complicated. We must be vigilant and follow the development of all forms of terrorism and violent extremism. New ways of recruiting, such as through online platforms and games, need to be understood and countered. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic situation has increased the spread of propaganda, hate speech, and conspiracy theories by extremist groups. The threat of far-right terrorism has grown in the West, also in terms of an increase in terrorist attack projects that seek to maximize casualties. International far-right online groups and messaging on social media platforms reinforce the transnational character of the extreme right, in addition to other forms of transnational connectivity. As the Finnish Minister of Interior, Ms. Maria Ohisalo, stated in her address at this year's high-level conference, our efforts to fight violent extremism and terrorism have to be knowledge-based. This means that the governments also depend on in-depth analysis and research in order not to lag behind with their action. The better informed we are, the more efficient and precise is our response. In addition, it is important to invest in skills such as common media literacy and critical thinking to build resilience against disinformation, manipulation, and extremist ideologies. People, in particular the youth, must have means to recognize the difference between violent extremist propaganda and critical views or statements of opinion. This spring, the EU adopted legally binding rules to address the dissemination of terrorist content online and to remove quickly such material from online. This, to my mind, is a positive step forward. There are also other international initiatives to combat the use of internet for terrorist and violent extremist purposes, such as the above-mentioned Christchurch call launched by New Zealand and France in 2019, and Finland is one of the partner countries of this call. Dear participants, the recently updated terrorist threat assessment by the Finnish Security and Intelligence Service, published in the end of March, states that while the threat of radical Islamist terrorism has remained at the previous level, the danger of extreme right-wing terrorism has grown in Finland. The service has identified far-right operators with the capacity and motivation to mount a terrorist attack. Also, indications of concrete preparation of attacks have emerged. The far-right operators who have become counterterrorism targets in Finland are typically linked to the extreme right-wing international online environment. In Finland, concrete measures to counter terrorism and prevent violent extremism are defined in two different policy documents, which are regularly updated by the government. Our action employs both soft and hard measures, either together or separately. These key policy documents, the National Counterterrorism Strategy and the National Action Plan on Preventing Violent Radicalization and Extremism, are in compliance with our EU and international obligations and commitments. Finally, I would like to inform you that last September, on 22nd September to be precise, the Supreme Court of Finland banned the Nordic Resistance Movement, which is a national socialistic group supporting far-right extremist ideology. According to the Supreme Court, the goals and activity of this group were contrary to the principles of a democratic society. Therefore, and in accordance with the Association Act, the grounds to ban the movement existed. The Supreme Court thereby upheld the rulings of the lower courts in this case. I should note that the banning of an association in Finland is a very unusual measure and requires strong evidence to prove that activity violates the basic values to the extent that enables the authorities to interfere with the freedom of association. While the ban of the Nordic Resistance Movement has already provided concrete support to authorities, for example, by allowing to prohibit planned events, I should note, however, that there are signs that the activities of the banned group have been continued under different names, for example, a group called Towards Freedom. And I thank you for your attention.
Päivi, thank you very much for sharing with us that overview of the threat as Finland sees it, and also sharing with us some of the measures that have been taken in Finland to deal with the threat. And I think we may come back to some of that in the Q&A session, but thank you for those concrete examples. That's really helpful. Next, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Laila. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Noreen, and thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Soufan Center for inviting me to this panel on such an important topic. And thank you also for adding this topic to the very crowded, what I know is a very crowded CT week or 2 weeks that we're in. Great to share this panel, or the screen, if you like, with such wonderful co-panelists, all of whom I look very much forward to hearing from and learning from, and all of whom I have an incredible respect for when it comes to both practical experience and research in the field. Thank you also to the partners and the co-hosts who we've heard from earlier. A very good evening to everyone from Oslo, Norway. I've been asked to reflect on how the threat of right-wing terrorism, religiously and ethnically motivated terrorism, has evolved, with a particular focus on our experiences in Norway. I will make a few comments based on my own observations, but also based on others people's research here in Norway. I will also share some of the practical steps, the evaluations and measures that we put in place to address this threat here in Norway. I should note that the lessons are drawn not only from experience with violent right-wing terrorism, but on various forms of terrorism. And we know this is an evolving policy-making field. We divide the timeline, or the landscape, if you like, on violent right-wing extremism here in Norway in roughly two time periods. Firstly, the 1990s, very early 2000s, we saw some very visible neo-Nazi groups in Norway. There were few, but had some charismatic leaders that organized rallies and demonstrations, focusing on nationalism and anti-immigrant feelings. This culminated in the racially motivated murder of the 15-year-old Benjamin Hermansen in 2001 in Oslo. After this attack, the groups were so stigmatized and in many ways dissolved. And what has characterized these movements since then has been precisely their lack of leadership, the lack of leaders and the lack of organization. Active, targeted, and very successful so-called exit programs involving the local communities and police were introduced that were later exported to other countries in Europe, notably Sweden. And I'm sure my friend Robert might touch on them later. In 2011, Norway then experienced a terrorist attack that had killed 69 young people at the youth camp outside of Oslo, and 8 people in our government building in central Oslo. The terrorist, Anders Behring Breivik, we know, acted on his own, but was in no way a lone actor. He was inspired and in turn has inspired others. As such, he was part of a more global movement of violent right-wing terrorism. 8 years later, in 2019, we experienced another attempted terrorist attack. Philip Manshaus first killed his adopted sister of Chinese origin and went on to attempt to carry out an attack on the Al-Noor Mosque in Bærum outside of Oslo. We know Manshaus was inspired by Breivik and by the Christchurch terrorist Brenton Tarrant. He adopted ideology and the tactics. He regretted and was ashamed that he was not able to kill more than he did. And we know that he was made fun of for this among his peers. Now, the Norwegian Police Security Service now considers it just as likely that far-right extremists would attempt to carry out new terrorist attacks in Norway as extremist Islamists will do. While the threat from radical Islamists is still there, we know that the only terrorist attacks that we've seen on Norwegian soil have been perpetrated by violent right-wing terrorists. It's high on our agenda. The 2 cases above and the developments we've seen have shown us the transnational character of ideology, of inspiration of this kind, this form of terrorism. There's a whole family out there on the internet that learn from each other and inspire each other. The internet has become a hiding place for many of them, many anonymous, making it even more difficult for local communities, police, etc., to pick up suspects. Terrorism as we knew it as a theater, now is also a game where you can play a game on the internet, playing that you are the terrorist yourself, where you yourself are the active actor. After both terrorist attacks, Norway conducted evaluations of the attacks and the response to the attacks. These evaluations became tools to develop policies and recommendations on both prevention and on response mechanisms, useful and extremely valuable insights. While Norway received international recognition for the way we publicly responded after the Breivik terrorist attacks in 2011, the wording, the roses, etc., and many of you will remember the images. The debate is still very high on why we're still seeing an increase in hate crime, in anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sentiments. 10 years after the attacks, many believe there's still a need for a thorough evaluation of the mindset of Breivik and his followers. 2 national action plans have been developed since 2011. Action plans with key recommendations for all of society, across the government, from the very top at the Prime Minister's office down to the very local community, with an all of society approach. Many have made important contributions to the work, from religious communities and NGOs to research communities and numerous government agencies across the board. The approach and many of these measures are constantly developed, and new measures have been added. And the goal of the 2 plans remain, namely to catch people in the risk zone as early as possible and to meet them with measures that work, a constant work in progress. While we see that the threat from terrorism is global, the plans both are clear in that effective and sustainable solutions can often and should be found at the very local level. Civil society actors, community leaders, school teachers, youth representatives, municipality workers, and all others acting as our first line of defense against those who instigate hate have been included in this work. There's also a lot of emphasis on youth engagement, youth inclusion, even down to daycare levels, kindergartens, youth and children, young voices. Those who can play a key role in preventing radicalization, and to keep a focus on youth perceptions of their own grievances. They may also hold the solutions to the key challenges. We should ever engage in youth in meaningful discussions on resilience, on what violence means, what democracy means, to diminish influence from violent extremism on the local level, as well as on online platforms. Finally, capacity building across the board has been important. Essential to this has been a targeted priority given to research, as my Finnish colleague has mentioned as well, research on the different phenomena of terrorism and the countermeasures. We know more now than we did in 2011, but the threat keeps evolving. And so research relevant to policy development must be prioritized. I should also mention right at the end, the great cooperation I think we all would say that we have amongst our Nordic countries, where experiences are shared, although we're different, we also do see similarities. We see this in the RAN network, we see that in the Nordic Safe Cities and the Secure Cities network, the Global Community Engagement Resilience Fund, the GSERF, other more global platforms, if you like, or European platforms and similar platforms, that we can see where we share experiences and constantly learn from them. I'll leave it at that, Noreen, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila, for highlighting those actions and for reinforcing the importance of knowledge-based policy and those partnerships. You know, we were very pleased to see that in the new U.S. domestic terrorism strategy. And I think the experiences you and Päivi have both shared already highlight how important those partnerships with communities, with researchers, and other faith-based groups also are in terms of informing policy. I think this makes for a great segue to Robert Orell's work in terms of Exit Sweden and then now with RAN. Robert, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for that, Noreen. Good evening from Stockholm. I would also like to thank the organizers, the Soufan Group, the Airey Neave Trust, and the United States and United Kingdoms for arranging this panel. It's a pleasure to be here to share this screen with the distinguished group of presenters. It's a rich amount of experience and knowledge we gather here. So we talk about violent far-right extremism, and if we look back on the history, the history of attacks is really something that we saw came already in the 60s, 70s in Italy. Here we saw the emerging building of the modern right-wing extremist scenes. We saw what's called the leaderless resistance, of organizing in small cells who, independent from each other, carried out attacks but still joined by a common ideology and an agenda. We saw the development and emerging groups coming in the US in the 1980s, specifically the Order or the Silent Brotherhood, who were active in several bank robberies, in murdering the radio host Alan Berg, and prepared for a coming race war. They were inspired by the author William Pierce's books, The Turner Diary and The Hunter, and since then, the inspirations still live on from these groups, from these publications, as marchers, as seen as idols. So what we're talking about here is not something new. This is not something that we saw coming up the last decade or two, but this has several decades of activities and history and experiences. And we have to have this in mind when we think of responses and understanding these environments. We heard of attacks from Oslo, El Paso, Christchurch, and others where the perpetrators aimed at initiating increased conflict or even race wars in accordance with the violent far-right extremist ideology. And together with the shifting landscape, what we see today, one of the colleagues at the Soufan group mentioned the smorgasbord, the salad bar ideology, where we see really the range of different parts of the ideology that individuals or groups pick and choose to put together. We see violent far-right extremists liaised with anti-lockdown protests, with anti-government protests, to recruit and spread distrust in societies. So here we need to acknowledge the spread and growth of violent far-right extremism, to also respond properly, to respond with research, with policies and toolkits that are proportionate to the threat that we see emerging. When it comes to exit work, which is really my field of work and my experience, it focuses on supporting the reintegration of former members. So individuals who decided they wanted to change and leave their involvement. It focuses on rebuilding social identity. When you join these groups, you usually engage in a very strong sense of identity of who you are, who you identify with, and who your opponents are. And to rebuild this, to re-engage with new relations, to rebuild a social identity takes time, and usually cooperation between a range of different partners and actors. So the element of time would be my main point. This is not something we do swiftly or hastily. We don't have a project of exit work working for 6 months and we solve it. In my work with Exit Sweden, the longest standing client is serving lifetime in prison and has been in contact with Exit for 20 years. This is way longer than a 2-3 year project where we aim to solve this. So I would like to refocus from project or short-term initiatives to really invest in long-term change. When we look at exit work, this usually happens offline. So meeting people in real life, supporting them with their needs, joining meetings with authorities, helping to rebuild trust in the function in society that will need to be part of helping. But we also see in the wake of the pandemic, the growth of the digital exit work, primarily by the pioneering work of Exit USA, which I was part of supporting their work, where this is a fully virtual program, where the support is online in video calls, in writings, or in support groups. The focus of exit work looks at trust building, and here we have a challenge to identify who is it that builds trust. How do we identify the individuals who can reach and build trust with people who distrust society, distrust media, distrust research and academia, distrust policymakers, distrust teachers, police officers, law enforcement? How do we create surfaces of cooperation, of trust building? Once again, this takes time. One of the points that we see helpful is to have a individualized approach where we look at the context of the specific individual. Who is he or she? What type of background or circumstances is relevant? And how do we need to engage? Because if we look at the clients and the audience of exit work, it might be 15, 16-year-olds who's been active for a year or two. It might be people who are 25, 30 and building their career for 10, 15 years. Or it might be people who are 40 plus who serve long prison sentence, and they have very different needs and circumstances. So really to adapt and have a flexible approach. What I suggest as the next steps to engage further is to facilitate more exchange between practitioners and policymakers to ensure the understanding of the practices, of the needs, the challenges and opportunities, to really engage in how can we enlarge and enrich the exit type of works around the globe, to enlarge and enrich the number of actors who are engaged in this, and to ensure quality. What type of quality standards do we put up for individuals who are engaged in these groups? And one perspective that we seldom talk about is the costs for extremism. When I still worked at Exit Sweden, we had a national econom who made a calculation of society's cost for individuals engaged in violent far-right extremism. This was an initial calculation. It was not comprehensive. The researchers identified 250 separate points of cost, which, for example, did not include security services, so not comprehensive, but an initial scratch of the topic. And what they calculated was that one individual cost roughly 3 million euros to be active in this group. Low counted, not calculating all cost. So if we think of costs for engaging in preventing and responding to these groups, we have some type of measures to look at what this costs. And also this is only the economic side of the harm and damage done by involvement in these environments. This is not the social, physical, mental, or family aspects that we need to engage to have a comprehensive picture. If I'm not wrong, I think the Oslo attack in 2011 costs around 150 million euros. So just to give ideas, so what type of cost are we talking about for involvement in these groups? Lastly, I would like to finish with just a brief recommendation on learning from adjacent fields. So we have a few decades of counterterrorism and prevention and countering violent extremism. And I would really encourage to learn from the range of different aspects and experiences we have across ideological spectrums, but also to explore experiences from other related and adjacent fields like conflict transformation, conflict management, restorative justice, or re-engaging in communities. With this, thank you very much, and I leave it back to you, Noreen.
Thank you so much, Robert, for giving those very personal and professional insights and those concrete examples of how the exit programs work and what it takes and what it means to go through that process. Last but never least, I'd like to turn over the screen to Colin for your take on the threat. Colin, the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Noreen, and thanks to all of our sponsors and supporters for bringing everyone together for this really important event. The threat of right-wing extremism, white supremacy, is transnational. There's no doubt about that, and this threat has evolved over time. I think the title of this event, A Perfect Storm, is exactly right, because that's what we've seen with various factors and variables percolating at the same time to serve almost as a force multiplier. We've had conspiracies, disinformation, people locked down over the course of the last year and a half, during the pandemic, which has caused high levels of anxiety, depression. And in the United States, that's a toxic combination when layered on top of a population that's well armed and angry. And we've seen the ramifications of that here. I think, the fact that people have been imbibing this propaganda, which has really served to elevate this threat, it feels like a powder keg here right now. And one of the things that I'm very concerned about as we move forward and we continue to track these trends in this evolution is now that we're getting, at least in some parts of the world, to a reopening and travel restrictions are lifted, what will members of these movements begin to do? So they've been online, they've been communicating with one another, now they can travel. So they're going to be building these networks out, working on establishing rapport, perhaps vetting each other to see if the person that they've been communicating with on encrypted platforms is real. And now we'll start seeing events, right? Like we've seen in the past, white power music festivals, MMA fights, where individuals congregate, where they share tactics, techniques, and procedures, where they build on not only knowledge shared over the internet, but tangible knowledge, right? And when we see that transfer of knowledge in terms of what works and what doesn't, right? I mean, terrorist organizations, particularly the most effective ones, are learning organizations, and that's something that we need to be prepared for. The other, second order effect of reopening, and as this unfolds at various clips in different parts of the world, we're going to see more soft targets. And I know that the UN and the GCTF have done a lot of work on the threat of soft targets. And so we're going to see things that we enjoy, normal things like street fairs and farmers markets, all of a sudden, become risks and vulnerabilities in some ways. And so that's something to keep an eye on as well. The threat also has to, cover the political aspect, because we've seen the rise of populism, far-right political parties attempting to leverage some of the troubles of the past year and a half and use them to their advantage in terms of what's caused the COVID-19 pandemic. I've described it before as an extremist buffet, because every type of extremist group has been able to put their own spin on it. Jihadis have their own reasons that they've been telling people why this happened. Far-right extremists have been blaming it on immigrants and others and saying this is why we need strong borders. So it's been quite malleable for different groups to attempt to leverage and to win new recruits. And I think that's something else that we need to keep an eye on. There's this lag effect. We're in a period of the unknown right now where we don't really know, since we're still in the middle of it, what the impact of COVID-19 will be. But my sense is that a lot of these groups believe they have momentum and they feel energized and they're growing. We just don't know how much they're growing. This is a broad tent movement. That's another part of the evolution. We've seen white supremacists, neo-Nazis, anti-government groups in the United States. I'd add militias to that, and conspiracy theorists as well, including QAnon. And that's a movement that is now growing and expanding globally. We had a big research report on that recently, and it's a truly transnational phenomenon that traditional US and Western adversaries have engaged in promoting because it tears at the social fabric of our societies. If you just look at some of the groups involved in the broader far right, Atomwaffen, the Base, the Russian Imperial Movement, Nordic Resistance Movement, Blood and Honor, Combat 18, with Canada taking the lead in designating some groups, including designating the Three Percenters, which is a US-based group. The US is now becoming a net exporter of far-right violent extremism, and I think we need to recognize that fact. Ukraine has become somewhat of a hub for violent white supremacy. And we've seen other strange wrinkles, like white supremacists fetishizing Rhodesia, the current Zimbabwe, and looking back to that as something to emulate in terms of building a white ethno-state. We've also seen global icons emerge among the far right, including individuals we've talked about today, not only Anders Breivik, but also Brent and Tarrant, who have been referenced in the manifestos of others who came after them and will continue to do so. What to do about it is much different. I think a few of the things that I'd like to key in on are phrases that we heard throughout all of the talks, and there's a common thread. And the first one is long-term. This is a generational struggle. This isn't an issue that cropped up overnight, and it's certainly not one that is going to go away overnight. I think, one of the things that we discuss often at the Soufan Center is the role of education, not only in terms of digital literacy, which is extremely important, but also the role of education in teaching young people about the Holocaust. They should not be learning about such an important event through meme, right? Where it's often downplayed and denigrated. And that's the first time that young people are hearing about this, not knowing what to make of it, whether or not to take it seriously. And so that's something that we talk about quite often. Civics education, particularly in the United States. I made a comment on Twitter. I said after 9/11, real patriots wanted to show their patriotism by joining the military. After 1/6, as we call it here, if you want to be a patriot, go become a high school civics teacher, because clearly the way people think about patriotism in this country has been turned on its head. Who are the real patriots and who are not? But that's a long-term endeavor, and that's not something that politicians like to hear. It's not something that's going to be solved in an electoral cycle. It's going to take significant investment that we might not always see the immediate payoff from. And that gets to some of the things that Lila talked about, which is measurement, evaluation, and assessment. We have to know, is what we're doing working? Is it not working? And if it is working, why is it working, right? Trying to identify those causal mechanisms if we can. And then I think, lastly, as we approach the 20-year anniversary of September 11th, I think we need to be careful about how we talk about this, right? Because we need a comprehensive and rigorous assessment of what we've done for the last 20 years, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what's applicable to the fight against far-right extremism, because some things will be applicable and others will not, and we can't just transpose that. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And so that's something I think we need to be very cognizant about moving forward in terms of what we do. But I think one thing that does resonate, and again, this is another common thread I heard throughout all of the talks, is the importance of our international partners. That's not just a buzzword or a phrase, a throwaway phrase, as some would say. We really mean that. And how do we communicate and how do we cooperate with our partners abroad in order to make sure that it's not just one or two countries carrying the load in this fight, right? How do we kind of leverage existing capabilities to make progress in this very important fight? So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion after.
Thanks very much, Colin. I think we've heard from all our panelists today very much about this sort of transnational aspect of the threat, while there have been very different local and national iterations. When we first produced our report in 2019 on white supremacy extremism, I think there was some surprise at the focus on the transnational aspects. For a long time, violent far-right groups have been treated as national or domestic challenges. And I think we are seeing more and more attention to the transnational connectivity between these groups. And I think it was really, really helpful to hear from Irfan and Kingsley at the outset, and then from Lila, from Pivy and Robert and yourself, different iterations that have these common threads, which mean that when international actors get together and think about what we can do, there are some common elements. We've heard about narratives, we've heard about travel, we've heard about financing. It's true that the CT framework we've developed over the last 20 years won't transfer, but they're instruments in that toolbox that we could think about. But with that, I'd like to turn to each of you for a quick question. And then I have one or two questions that I'll open up to the group, but I have a couple of targeted questions. I'll lay them all out so you have about 10 seconds to think about them and about 30 seconds to answer them. So let me start. One question for Robert. You've worked with a number of participants in the exit groups, and I know over the years you've met a lot of different types of participants. You mentioned some very young, some much more advanced. What do you think was the single most compelling reason, or have you found a common compelling reason that encouraged an exit? Was it a narrative? Was it age? Was it a family crisis? I know there's no single magic bullet, but if there's a single compelling narrative that you've seen a common thread for people wanting to exit these groups. Päivi, my question to you would be about the education you mentioned. You talked a lot about teaching young people about critical thinking and disinformation early on. I wondered if you could tell us just a little bit more about how Finland has done that through the education system, or just a few thoughts on how that's worked. Laila, from your work on the Breivik Commission report, I wondered if I could ask if you think that the process itself was part of the solution. I know there was a lot invested in the work after the attack, and a lot came out in the report, which, as you've said, has underpinned a lot of policy. But I would love to hear your thoughts on whether the process of that commission itself you think was a helpful part of the solution. And Colin, you've laid out many different aspects of this perfect storm, as we call it, and you talked about the Salafi jihadist groups that we were focused on beforehand. What do you think are one or two of those key similarities between the groups? It's obvious why they're different. I think it'd be interesting to hear where you think there are similarities. So Robert, if I could go to you for a moment for your response.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there's a range of common factors that we identify with individuals who are motivated to leave. But I think one that sticks out is their experiences of their involvement, meaning that they saw a lot of things in the movement, in the lifestyle, within their comrades, that they didn't really come to terms with, meaning double standards. So these ideas, these groups have very high standards of way of life, of way of living, of how to act, but a lot of people in these groups don't really live up to those standards. Meaning you talk about purity in body and mind, you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't do drugs, you shouldn't do steroids, you should be honest, you should be a role model. But if we look at a practical lived life, this is not always the case. We have a lot of drinking, a lot of steroids. We have groups that talk about the acceptance of using white drugs, meaning amphetamine and ecstasy, as accepted. So when we identify reasons, it's usually that individuals start to reflect, what am I into? What is this? And I think not always challenging their ideological orientation, but rather the confusion over, we say one thing and then I experience something totally different. And this doesn't make sense. This just doesn't seems meaningful. So this would be one of the reasons that we clearly see, which last comment we also then can use in terms of shifting perspectives by focusing on this. Instead of going into ideological orientation and discussion, we can focus on the lifestyle and the double standards and the problems with being active in these groups.
Thanks so much, Robert. Päivi, can I turn to you?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, absolutely extremely important question, which I mean, you addressed to me, Noreen. Education. And I think Colin already, I mean, phrased it, I mean, perfectly well. I mean, we start from the basic education, obviously. It absolutely has to provide skills to our young people, our youth, on the basic values. So what I want to emphasize that when we use, and when I, for example, referred, I mean, to the phrase of that our action needs to be in full respect of the rule of law and international law and the human rights. So that is, of course, the basic, I mean, basis from where we have to start with our young people, with our youth. And then, of course, what is absolutely also important, and where also in Finland we target our I mean, measures in our national action programs and action plans, obviously to ensure and that those professionals working with children, I mean, whether they're teachers or tutors or, I mean, after school, I mean, activity people, I mean, they have to understand, I mean, also how to address these issues they have to be given means to recognize possible signs of individual young person, for example, getting more and more radicalized one way or the other. And of course, also international cooperation. I mean, Robert, for example, he himself has been assisting Council of Europe in addressing these kind of issues. I mean, how you, provide tools to teachers at schools in particular to address these issues. So Robert could, easily provide much more details on this activity that we went together through in Council of Europe. But this kind of, I want to summarize by going back to the basic education system. It has to provide also these means to all and every children.
Thank you so much, Päivi. Laila?
Sure, Noreen. So you asked me the question about the 22nd of July Commission, or Breivik Commission, as it's also called. This process, the commission lasted for a whole year. It was a very secret commission, but very public at the same time. It brought out a lot of questions. But the mandate of the commission was really to look at preparedness, responses after an event. So some of the criticism that has been put, and we're right in that at the moment, and this summer with a 10-year anniversary, or marking 10 years since the attack, has really been, have we had that real cleanup, if you like, of the ideology, of understanding where he came from and how he became who he was. But I still think that, these 12 months did put a lot of questions out on the table, out in the public, in the media. And parallel to this, you had a very public court case of the terrorist himself. So there was a lot of debates going on in the media of this. And an evaluation, even though it was just the response and the preparedness, emergency preparedness questions, it does raise some of these issues related to what kind of terrorist threat did we see? Part of the criticism was that we had too much focus on radical Islamist terrorists, and we had not been prepared at all for looking at violent right-wing extremism. So that's one of the things which I think created a debate in the discussion. But at the moment, we're right there where the discussion is: was the debate good enough, deep enough to look at the ideology? And that's for everyone to judge. I think the discussion is there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laila. Colin?
Sure. I think there's quite a number of important similarities between the jihadist threat and far-right extremists today. One, I'll mention the use of the internet, and we've talked about that kind of at length. I think it was Laila that said the internet is a hiding place, right? Which may seem counterintuitive, but it really is. And terrorists are quite sophisticated. So if you look at the propaganda that they're spreading, it's sophisticated both aesthetically, but also in terms of its messaging and narrative. It really resonates with the intended target audience. We're talking to you today from New York City, home of Madison Avenue, and I think they've taken something out of the ad agency's playbook here, because these are really finely tuned and tailored messages that land with various demographics. You want to reach a younger audience? Go where the younger audience is. Go through gaming platforms, and they've done that. So I think the use of the internet for recruitment and mobilization, for communicating surreptitiously, these are all things that jihadis and right-wing extremists have done well. Brings me to my second point, which is that they're both highly opportunistic, and they are really expert at taking advantage of crises, whether that's COVID-19 or economic crises caused by recessions. Right? There's a message there ready to recruit and lure vulnerable people in to explain, here's what's causing the change and the struggles that you're seeing all around you. But they're also opportunistic in terms of tactics. We've seen that with the trend in vehicle attacks, We're now seeing that with a move to 3D printed weaponry, and I'm very concerned about what we're likely to see with these individuals and groups harnessing drones in the near future.
Thanks so much, Colin. I had teed up a number of questions on a bit of future casting, looking at where we see the threat evolving and where we see the role of the UN, but I'm afraid the clock is not being my friend, and I'll have to save that for another webinar where I hope we can all reconvene and take that question forward. But I'd really like to thank all of you for sharing those perspectives. I think having some of those very concrete examples to share and some of those very concrete action points helps us think through, what are some of the lessons we've learned from dealing with this threat. As many of you have said, it's not new. So I thank you to all of you for answering those questions and sharing your perspectives. Before we go toward the conclusion of the event, I'd like to turn over the screen to our very important partners from the Airey Neave Trust, who are in fact supporting our project, which will look at the evolution of the violent far-right threat in the US and the UK and look at some of the repercussions of 1/6, as we call it. So it's my great honor and privilege now to turn over the screen to Hugh Tilney and Tim Wilson, who are on the board of the Airey Neave Trust. Thank you. Hugh, who is vice chair of the trust, will, I believe, go first.
Thank you very much, Noreen. The Airey Neave Trust was formed in Airey's memory in 1979, shortly after his assassination by Irish terrorists. Airey Neave was a lawyer, soldier, war hero, author, and politician. He was the first British officer to escape from Colditz Castle, a prison that Germans claimed to be escape-proof. After his return to England via Switzerland, southern France, and Spain, he joined MI9, a unit working to rescue Allied troops stranded behind enemy lines in Europe. After the end of World War II, Airey played a significant role at the Nuremberg trials. He handed the indictments to each of the 23 defendants personally and assisted them in finding defense counsel, a truly Herculean task. After the trial, Airey became a Conservative Member of Parliament. He also wrote several books recounting his war experiences. In 1975, he ran Margaret Thatcher's campaign to take over the leadership in opposition of the Conservative Party. As a result of this success, he was offered any cabinet post that he wished in a future Conservative government. To the surprise of many, he chose the Northern Ireland portfolio, an area that he had covered in opposition. Airey held the strong belief that the UK should reinstitute the death penalty for acts of terrorism. It was for this reason that the Irish National Liberation Army placed a balanced bomb in his car, which exploded as he exited the House of Commons car park on the afternoon of March 30th, 1979. On May the 4th, 1979, the Conservatives were returned to power, sadly without Airey in the cabinet. The objectives of the Airey Neave Trust are to give financial support for writings, lectures, and seminars dealing with all forms of terrorism and extremism. To name a few of our fellow trustees, apart from myself and Tim, our chairman is Lord Arbuthnot, who, when he was in the House of Commons, chaired the House of Commons Defence Committee for 9 years. We also have David Van Ness, who, as many of you may know, was an extremely senior officer at Scotland Yard. He headed many negotiations, including the siege of the Iranian embassy in April and May 1980. We also have Sir Kenneth Tebbit, who was formerly head of GCHQ. There's an excellent biography of Airey Neave written by Patrick Bishop and published in 2019. The title is The Man Who Was Saturday. Saturday was Airey's code name at MI9. Noreen, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for sharing that background and those stories and that very important example of the work being done also by the Airey Neave Trust. Thank you very much for your support of this project. It's really a pleasure to work together. Tim, the screen is yours.
Of course, I have to be the first one who fails to unmute themselves efficiently. Apologies for that. Both as a trustee of the Airey Neave Trust and as director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews, it's a huge honor to offer a few closing remarks. It seems appropriate to be talking about the threat from the extreme right, given both Airey Neave's distinguished record as a warrior against fascism, and also, of course, the fact that the United Nations itself was built upon the ruins of an attempted fascist world order. I am, by training, a historian, and I was a little apprehensive before today's session that background might not be of much use. I'm always admiring of those in the Soufan Center with their appetite for future casting, and Colin Clark, particularly with his wise peerings into the future. I'm always admiring of those who take that risk. Historians tend to react to the invitation to talk about the future with all of the enthusiasm of vampires for sunlight. I wondered if this might not be the right angle to come in at. But in fact, as the discussion I think has shown today, there have been frequent references to the deep past and the momentum of the deep past, which I think we do have to navigate. On the academic side, terrorism studies at its worst is a bit like a sort of aquarium full of, or perhaps a sort of Great Barrier Reef full of clownfish that turn to whatever new current swings them from Islamist terrorism to the far right promiscuously. But as today's discussion has shown, these threats are not the same, however much there may be resemblances. And really, I suppose my very basic point here is that for Western societies, in particular, the threats of white supremacism and violent extremism on the right have deep roots. This is not an external threat that will erupt out of an azure blue sky like that awful morning nearly 20 years ago on 9/11. All of the countries represented in supporting today's sessions have basically fascist or neo-fascist traditions that date back nearly a century or so. And those flames, as Lila, I think, pointed out very eloquently, those flames have often burnt low. We can often turn those flames down, but they've never quite gone out. And that sheer resilience should, I think, give us some pause for thought and reflection. It doesn't mean that it's the same far right or extreme right. Of course it doesn't. I think, the great shift that's happened in my lifetime has been that transition from a essentially Nazi type model of the strong state to a much more libertarian, amorphous, highly individualistic sort of North American model of mobilization. And we tend to be easily dazzled by the sheer bizarreness of contemporary online extreme right subcultures. Again, I like Colin's all-you-can-eat salad buffet image, but we need to be aware that many of those ingredients that have been chopped up and so promiscuously remixed are old. They have resonance precisely because of that inherited power of associations from the past. That's why we get a shock when we see a Confederate flag waved within the walls of the Capitol. I was also very gratified to see this was a session about conspiracy theories as well. I think we do need to talk about conspiracy theories in white supremacism. Conspiracy theories are paradoxically a form of mass elitism. They're a form of sort of comfort blanket of the alienated. Their appeal is inherently supremacist. We, the elite, can see what the rest of you cannot. We are the less deceived. And what is always interesting about them is not primarily their content, however lurid and eye-catching, but their resonance. Every age, every society has loud-mouthed bigots who flirt with violence. The much more interesting question is why they occasionally get a large and attentive hearing, as they seem to be so tragically in recent years. Whatever answers we come up with to that challenge and that difficult exam question, it is clear that the challenge is a deep one, both culturally and structurally. And we will need all the help we can get from each other and all of the inherited wisdom that we have learned, which is why I think today's strategic dialogue, with its emphasis on internationalism, mutual respect and learning, and taking long-term views, of course, appeal to me as a historian who likes to think in longer timeframes. Talking of time, however, I'm well aware that I may be trading upon your patience. The Soufan Center has wonderfully given us this platform with a truly relentless logistical efficiency, despite my stumbling over unmuting. I'm deeply grateful to that. Noreen is, of course, by reputation, a terrifyingly tight timekeeper in a very good way, I hasten to add. And so it feels highly appropriate, without further ado, to hand back to her for the last word. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Much appreciated, and really, really helpful to get that perspective. I think, much of what we were saying, even in the policy space, not everything is new. We have to look back a lot to learn about where we can go forward. We've had this very rich, substantive discussion on the margins of the high-level conference at the UN as member states are agreeing a review of the global counterterrorism strategy, and we know there will be some very important discussions at the UN this fall or this autumn about the role of some of the Security Council bodies. All of this means that this is a unique opportunity as we think, 2 decades after 9/11, about what international action to counterterrorism will look like in the years ahead. What will the bodies, the administration, the bureaucracy look like? What will mandates and resourcing look like? I'm a policy wonk, sorry. So I think in technical terms as well, what kind of resourcing, what kind of legislation will we look at domestically and internationally? And so I think all the lessons learned and shared today, we hope will continue to inform those discussions. And I do hope we can reconvene for a follow-up. I do need to thank very much the US, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Finland for supporting this project. That support really means a lot to us, and we look forward to continuing the discussion, and to the Airey Neave Trust, whom we will continue to work with this summer as we continue our research and our analysis. And finally, from my part, I need to thank Amanda Schmidt, Stephanie Foggett, and Mohammed Dawish, without whom none of this would really happen. They're the ones responsible for making this all work so smoothly. So thank you to the Soufan Center's comms team. Sorry if I rushed through things and mispronounced things and stumbled over words, but I really wanted to say it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be with all of you today. Thank you for joining us.